First, thank the university and all its representatives, and especially Thomas Beck-Manners for the organization of this really very interesting conference, and also, of course, for inviting me here. Otherwise, I wouldn't have noticed. Talking among such distinguished lawyers is a great honor for me, but it's not only an honor, it's a challenge. I think many of you have already noticed I'm not a lawyer, I'm a historian. And, well, I'll try to meet the challenge. My task is not only to help you survive your post-lunch depression, which certainly is heavy, lunch was good and abundant, but above all to shed some light into the history of lawyers in the German-speaking area. So let me first delimitate the issue of my talk. The territorial scope of my presentation is rather easy. It's Austria and Germany, with the history of both countries being strongly intertwined and still, well, that is still in present so, and also their cultures, including their legal culture. This seems to me to be a reasonable point for outset. The temporal scope is the short 20th century, a phrase that was coined by Eric Hobsbawm, to denominate the phase between the First World War and the end of the Cold War, roughly speaking 1914 to somewhere between 1989 and 91, dissolution of the Soviet Union. Finally, my substantive scope is the relation of lawyers to their political regimes and the impact this relation had on their social and professional responsibility, the overall issue of this conference. I will lay a certain focus on public lawyers, this not only because I think that because of their field of work, they even interact closer with their social and political surroundings, but also since I'm working at the Department of Public Law and they are nearer to my mind and maybe even to my heart. Okay, but enough introduction now. From 1914 to 1990, the territories that were delimited above saw 11 or 12 fundamentally different political regimes. Depending, 11 or 12 is depending on whether you see Austria as a country of its own in the phase of when it was annexed by Germany between 1938 and 1945, or if you don't. If you don't, they are 11. If you do, they are 12. Austria started into the 20th century as a huge multinational empire. It was the second largest in Europe after Russia. To transform into a very small republic in 1918. This republic turned into a clerico-authoritarian regime in the wake of the Great Depression, that was in 1933-34. It was a two-stage affair, which again was replaced by the Nazi rule in 1938's Anschluss. Only after the liberation in 1945, Austria finally became a democracy. Germany's 20th century history is even more chaotic. Starting out as a monarchy, the country turned into a republic in 1919 that was also unable to survive the Great Depression, giving way to the Nazi regime in 1933. After this age of catastrophe, that is Hobsbawm again, Germany was dissolved until 1949, with two states rising from the debris. A Western-style democracy and a people's democracy, whatever this really tautological term might mean. And these states united into today's Federal Republic of Germany in 1990. As usual, all of these regimes demanded explicit collaboration by their lawyers, be it contribution to their functioning, provision of legitimacy, or just the provision of an image as business as usual. Evidently, this was true for the dictatorships and for the monarchies at war, but also the republics asked for gestures of subjection. Theoretically, most of those regime changes would have required a complete exchange of the legal stuff, not only of the legal stuff, but also of the legal stuff. This was also seen by some, like the social democrat Rudolf Hilferding. He was an economist, whose ideas about the re-establishment of democracy in Germany already in the 1930s included the ousting of all compromised lawyers. But in reality, such a radical replacement happened only one in the GDR in the late 1940s, early 1950s. We will come to that later. And to a lesser extent, a second time in the early 1990s, when considerable parts of the GDR's legal apparatus were dissolved by the winners of the Cold War. So, in practice, regime changes were a common feature in the lives of Austrian and German lawyers. Monarchists had to ensure the functioning of republics. Republicans administered dictatorships. Supporters of dictatorial regimes had to pose as if they were democrats. This began with the Great War becoming an ideological crusade. Lawyers saw themselves pressed to legitimize their systems, their states, their political systems. In Austria, for example, Heinrich Lammasch, the most renowned public international lawyer the German-speaking area had at that time, argued against neutrality after Italy declared itself neutral in the war in spite of joining the Central Powers. Hugelmann, of whom we will hear again by and then, argued for the monarchical principle in professional journals of lawyers against the crude democracies that were standing on the other sides of the trenches. Liberty at seas, which meant the lawlessness of the British blockade of the Central Powers, was discussed by many lawyers, among them Hans Wieberg. He was later an internationally renowned pacifist. And he, for example, justified also the sinking of the Lusitania, a pacifist at that end. The sinking of the Lusitania in 1915 cost 1,200 lives, roughly speaking. Well, also, the Great War also had a positive impact in Germany, with this, or at least a little bit of positive impact. In Germany, with its traditionally poor jurisprudence in public international law that did not fit into the German political idea of realpolitik. You don't need international law if you're conducting realpolitik. The Great War led to an upturn of that discipline, but the people who worked in that discipline usually not dealt sympathetically with the new world order that emerged after the First World War, e.g. the League of Nations. Joseph Kunz from Vienna, who emigrated to the US in 1932, and Schücking from Berlin, the only German judge at the Permanent Court of International Justice of the League of Nations, perhaps were exceptions. But more lawyers criticized not only the global order, but the new political order in Germany. Following Carl Schmitt, of whom we heard today already, the leading and not stupid right-wing intellectual lawyer since the 1920s, most public lawyers vilified the Weimar Republic as bleak and weak, inappropriate to fit Germany's legal traditions as well as her ambitions. Ernst Forsthoff is a very classic example, although he did so under various aliases, possibly fearing that a republic that might survive in spite of its weakness might encroach on his career. The situation was slightly better in Austria at that time. Lawyers gathered around Hans Kelsen, the father of the Austrian constitution and the center of the Viennese School of Legal Theory, like the already mentioned Joseph Kunz or Erich Voegelin, who later fled the Nazis to the US. Also, the right wing of the political spectrum consisted of relatively moderate conservatives like Vittorelli. He was a historian of law and the first president of Austria's Constitutional Court, Adamovich, who was then professor in Graz, or Menzel. But also in Kelsen's Zeitschrift für öffentliches Recht, which was one of the leading journals in the German-speaking area at that time in public law, it can be observed that the right-wingers were taking more and more radical positions. For example, the already mentioned Hugelmann or Fritz Sander from Prague, who in 1938 even welcomed the creation of a Führerstaat, which cannot be translated into English, but perhaps most of you understand, or Ernst Wolgast from Rostock, who later was one of the most prominent public international lawyers of Nazi Germany. But both the German and the Austrian democracy did not survive the Great Depressions. And for lawyers in both countries, this had severe consequences. I will not go into the details since this would exceed the timescales of this or any talk by far, but at least it must be mentioned that the Jewish lawyers, for example, they in the first line, paid with their jobs, later with their home countries, and in most cases with their lives for the change. As well as it must be mentioned that opportunist Aryan colleagues of them, if you might call them colleagues, like Carl Schmitt, who took over Kelsen's chair in Cologne, or Forsthoff, who substituted Hermann Heller in Frankfurt, or Dahm, who occupied the chair of Kantorowicz in Kiel, or Ladenz, who replaced Gerhard Husserl, also in Kiel. Kiel was a very interesting thing. In Kiel, the Nazis formed what they called a Stoßtrupp University, Stoßtrupp Universität. You might translate that as Assault Detachment University, with the explicit aim to create a new jurisprudence that was compatible to this beer moth-styled state that Franz Neumann had described in the early 1940s. And finally, at least a brief reference must be made to the fact that many members of the anti-Nazi opposition also were lawyers, although it can be observed that they had not arrived in their careers so far as their opponents, who also outnumbered them by far. Well, the Austrian situation was more complicated, with an anti-German clerico-authoritarian regime ruling after closing down parliament in 1933 and a brief civil war in 1934. The conservatives of the 1920s easily reached an agreement with the regime, advancing their careers, like, for example, the already mentioned Adamowitsch, who became Austria's last pre-Anschluss Minister for Justice Affairs. On the other hand, for example, Hugelmann lost his chair in Vienna because he pleaded for the Anschluss, and although this was a common position at that time, it was a taboo for the regime, and that justified even draconic measures. They even threw him into prison. After the Anschluss, things reversed. Former career lawyers were ousted from their positions, and homines novi, mostly from the Old Reich, from Germany proper, and most of them declared Nazis, of course, flooded the country. 7 years later, in 1945, this situation reversed again. And pretending to have always been anti-Nazi, which was proven by the fact that they were ousted by the Nazis, advanced the career of the former conservatives considerably. Adamowitsch, for example, became dean in Vienna, later president of the Austrian Constitutional Court. Verhofstadt, who established the theory of Austria as the first victim of Nazism in Europe, became chairholder at Vienna, and etc., etc. There are many such cases. And in a counter-draw, of course, all lawyers who were exposed in the Nazi era lost their jobs, at least for a few years, some forever. This restoration contributed considerably to the relatively conservative climate in the Austrian judiciary that prevailed there until, well, the second half of the 1970s or so, which is quite a long time. In Germany, with the partition of the country in the beginning Cold War, the situation was much more complicated. In the Western occupation zones, denazification procedures hit heavily, at least on the upper ranks of lawyers in administration and also in the academia. Professors like Bilfinger, Forsthoff, Köhlreuter, or Carl Schmitt, they lost their chairs in the case of Carl Schmitt forever. Others, like Mounds, remained unmolested or even made good careers. But many lawyers from the middle ranks and the lower ranks advanced their careers rather easily in Western Germany. For example, Karl Maria Hettlage, who collaborated with Albert Speer in the expropriation of Berlin Jews while building Berlin as Germania, the capital of the world after the one war, which fortunately never happened. He became Undersecretary of the Treasury in the late 1950s. Hans Filbinger was a Navy judge who was responsible for many death sentences, and he was Prime Minister of the German state of Baden-Württemberg for very long years. And Kurt Georg Kiesinger, an overseas radio propaganda man of Joseph Goebbels, well, he even became Chancellor in 1966. But from the 1970s on, the role of the former Nazi lawyers, well, became slowly smaller. Whether because of public debates that often focused not so much on the deeds of the people but on their denial, like in the case of Filbinger, or simply because of old age. Things were different in Eastern Germany. Under the heading of democratization of the judiciary in the development of a democratic order, that was the phrase, first the Soviet and then the GDR authorities resorted to a tabula rasa strategy. About 95% of the academic lawyers in the general administration were ousted, and the rates in other areas like court administration, judges, public prosecutors, and so forth reached about 80%. Also, in the academia, purges happened, although it took until the Babelsberger Conference of 1958 to homogenize the universities. But also later, struggles like about the introduction of administrative jurisdiction popped up by, and then it never got really quiet there. But attractive as the tabula rasa solution might look at the first glance, it had two fundamental flaws, of course. First, the GDR just wasn't the democracy it claimed to be. And then, second, they had a lack of people. So they had to train superficially so-called people's judges, Volksrichter. They were educated in courses in the late 1940s that lasted 6 months. They were people not called on the street, but they were selected by party committees, and they were educated for 6 months or so, and afterwards acted as judges. Even they saw that this didn't work, and so the length of the education period became longer by and then up to 2 years in the early 1950s. But of course, that was a rather inappropriate method to create a functioning, qualitative judiciary. Didn't work. Nevertheless, although the country's legal system became more and more stable over time, only few of their structures survived the collapse of the so-called real-life socialism they had there. In the wake of the adaptation to the structures of the West, also the legal apparatus and the respective lawyers were, most of them at least, phased out, abgewickelt. It was a famous German word of that time. And many of the university chairs, for example, were occupied by young professors from the West. Well, okay, now the 70 years are almost over. It was a tour de force, I'm sorry for that. But one may also ask, what was this effort made for? And I think at least 3 points can be made. First, lawyers played a very important role in the very unpleasant Austrian and German history of the short 20th century. Because of their disproportionately high involvement in the management of state and society, also their historical role can be considered as being disproportionate, which is no reason to be satisfied or proud. Second, in spite of a first impression, not all lawyers between 1914 and 1945 were radical right-wing fanatics, but most of them were simply opportunists. For example, and adding to the examples I gave you before, most of the Nazi lawyers who were members of the Nazi party joined that party only in 1937, when it became clear that Nazism was here to stay in Germany, and when the freeze of for party membership was lifted. Before, nobody could enter. And before 1933, I think many of them who later became Nazi wouldn't have entered. But also this seems to be no reason to be satisfied or proud. Finally, it may be concluded that tabula rasa solutions lead nowhere, attractive as they may look on the first glance. In the long run, the Austrian and West German democracies proved to be much more effective than the GDR's ideological concepts to overcome the deficiencies German-speaking lawyers showed in the first half of, or the first two-thirds of the 20th century. And helped by the demographical change, this had led to the functioning legal systems Austria and Germany are experiencing today. Also, if nothing can be drawn from that with regard to satisfaction or proudness, at least this might be interpreted as an evidence that there is hope. Thank you very much.